Hello, everyone, and I hope you're doing well. In today's second reading from Mass, St. Paul gives us a challenge. Paul challenges us to choose kenosis rather than crankiness. Let me explain. We all throughout our life experience different losses. Things are taken away from us. This can wound us. In short, it can lead us to become cranky. During this time of the pandemic, we've all lost different things. For example, because we have to keep our bubbles small and social distance, we cannot spend time with people that we care about. Or perhaps our work or travel plans have been curtailed, have been cut short. These losses, if we're not careful, can become wounds that fester. We can become angry. We can lash out at people around us. We can start to blame others whose fault really have no fault in it at all. If we're not careful, then our losses can become wounds and we can become cranky about them. In the second reading today, taken from Paul's letter to the Philippians, Paul points us in a different direction. Paul wrote his letter to the Philippians in order to encourage this community that was suffering from losses to live with joy and peace. In fact, joy permeates this letter. It starts this way: "Rejoice in the Lord always. I say it again, rejoice." It's really remarkable that this letter has such a theme of joy in it when we consider Paul's personal circumstances when he wrote the letter. Paul, in fact, wrote this letter while he was in prison. He had suffered loss after loss. How can Paul possibly talk so much about joy when he's lost so much? How can Paul encourage a community that suffered such great losses to live with joy and peace? Paul encourages us to live with joy and peace in the midst of our suffering by holding out the example of Jesus Christ. In the second reading today, taken from Philippians 2, Paul quotes what is called the kenotic hymn of Jesus. It is, in other words, comes from the Greek word kenosis, meaning self-emptying. This hymn that Paul maybe learned from a community or church that he was in or made up himself talks all about how Jesus had loss after loss, one thing after another taken away from him, but ultimately at the end, God exalted him. Let me read just a little bit from this hymn. "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not deem equality with God something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. Being born in human likeness and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name." We see in this hymn how Jesus has one thing taken away from him after another. First, he's in some ways having his divinity cloaked as he becomes a human being. Then he becomes a slave, the lowest of slaves, and finally he dies. But at the end, God exalts Jesus. Why? Because Jesus accepted his self-suffering, his self-emptying, as a sacrifice that brought good to others. He accepted this out of love so that others could have life. The same goes for us in our life. In order to deal well with our losses, whether they're from the pandemic or elsewhere, it's important, I think, that we give purpose and meaning to our suffering. That we, as Jesus did, choose to accept our sacrifices that we make, our losses that we suffer, out of love for others. For example, during this pandemic, we suffer some losses, but we can choose to accept this with the sight or in mind of the fact that we are trying to protect other people, to preserve the health of others. When we give this kind of purpose to our suffering, when we see our suffering and sacrifices as a way that brings goodness to others, we too can be filled with joy and peace. We can be exalted as Jesus too was exalted. So as we get further and further into this pandemic, which hopefully will end soon, let us try then to take Paul's encouragement in the reading today, to choose kenosis, to imitate Jesus in his self-emptying rather than crankiness. God bless you and take care.